Hello, PentaxTips here. Today we have an Asahi Pentax Spotmatic F for an overview training video. This camera was released in 1973 and was the flagship model of the 1964 release of the original Spotmatic, containing that world-famous through-the-lens metering. This metering method was a new concept in the photography market. That is, the same light that passes through whichever lens you have attached to the camera to frame your scene is the same light that is used for metering. Not only that, but the Spotmatic F contained full open-aperture metering. This allowed the viewfinder to stay nice and bright during metering and image acquisition. This new technology took the market by storm, and the Spotmatic F became one of the best-selling film cameras of all time. The Spotmatic F was a professional, richly featured version of the Spotmatic. Spotmatic F would be billed as the world's most popular 35mm SLR camera. We're going to cover all the aspects of the camera. Check the timestamps in the description to jump to specific topics. Looking at the front of the camera, we have the prominent Asahi Pentax branding, in addition to the Asahi Optical Company logo engraving at the front of the pentaprism housing. And just to the side, we see the model name, Spotmatic F. We have metal strap lugs on each side of the camera, flash sync ports on one side, and a self-timer mechanism on the other. On the side of the mirror box, we have a switch to activate the depth of field preview. You can also see the camera is equipped with an improved internal aperture push pin actuator. It will sort of punch the pin instead of a paddle slap. And of course, the revered M42 screw mount. This was and is an extremely popular universal screw mount used across many other brands. Because of this, the second-hand market for M42 mount lenses is plentiful. And remember, all these lenses can be adapted to modern Pentax DSLRs with an affordable, genuine adapter. The back of the camera is very understated. It contains the eye-level viewfinder, the camera film back door, and another Asahi Optical Company engraving. The bottom of the camera contains our regular tripod screw mount. Also our film rewind release button, and our battery is under this screw-on cover. The camera's native batteries require 1.35 volt mercury oxide button cell battery called PX625. That is no longer being manufactured. See a video linked below to learn more about the Spotmatic batteries. For the Spotmatic F, you can either use the higher voltage alkaline batteries and adjust your exposure to compensate for your results, or you can use a zinc oxide battery called wine cells to provide the exact voltage required. Anyway, batteries for the Spotmatic F are readily available and can produce excellent results. The top of the camera, stored away, is a film rewind crank. Lifting up the crank releases the film back door. Beneath the film rewind crank, we have two film reminder dials. The first outer ring rotation of the dial will select between 20 and 36 in this lower window, reminding you of the film canister's total frame count. By lifting up the crank, you can more easily access the inner second ring. Rotating the ring with these grips on each side here, and will indicate in the upper window for either black and white film, daylight color balanced, or tungsten color balanced film. Next we have our engraved serial number and a Spotmatic F model designation. We have a very handy top-mounted X-Contact hot shoe. On the top right, we have a shutter speed selector dial with 11 stops between 1 second exposure and the max shutter of 1/1000th of a second. The shutter speed is indicated by this small arrow to the left of the dial. Also, for long exposures, a bulb mode is available where the shutter will remain open for however long you have the shutter button pressed down. The X next to 1/60th of a second marks our flash sync speed. So ensure you have your shutter selected to this speed when utilizing an external flash. Inlaid into the shutter dial contains our ASA selection. This is an equivalent to our more modern ISO standard of film speed. You can select your ASA by raising up the outer edge of the dial and rotating. Here you can select between an ASA of between 20 and 3200. Next up, of course, we have our shutter release button, which is actually also a screw port for a remote shutter release. This shutter release features an extremely appreciated shutter locking switch, preventing the shutter from accidentally tripping when not in use. If you can see that little L, that means the lock is engaged. The shutter lock has a nifty feature that is used in bulb mode for long exposures, in the case when you've forgotten your remote shutter release. Of course, set the camera up on a tripod, but when you press the shutter, you can hold the release while rotating the lock to keep the shutter open for however long of an exposure you need. When your exposure is complete, just rotate the lock to close the shutter. Last up, we have our Rapid Wind Film Advance lever, beautifully curved for right-hand thumb operation. On top of the Film Advance is a windowed display featuring our frame counter that is automatically reset when you open the camera back. Next to the dial contains a wind indicator to let the photographer know if their next shot is already wound when it's red, and it turns black when the shutter is tripped. To load film into the camera, first, before you forget, set the ASA dial in the camera to that of the film speed you're loading into the camera. Also, utilize those film reminder dials to indicate what sort of film you've loaded. Next, pull the film rewind crank up to a position where it sits comfortably, then pull up once again to release the spring-loaded door latch. Place your film canister into the left side of the camera and push the film rewind crank back down into the canister. Pull the leader across the film runner guide rails and insert the leader firmly into the film take-up spool. Now you can advance your film and release the shutter until the take-up sprockets engage with the film perforations. You can now close the door and the camera back pressure plate will hold the film flat to the image plane. You can now advance the film and release the shutter, repeating until the film indicator is set to 0. You can also tell that your film is loaded correctly by the rewind crank rotating counterclockwise while you advance to the next frame. The Spotmatic F was a top-of-the-line manual exposure camera. However, there are niceties to help guide your exposure along the way. If you're new to photography, linked below is a video with an overview of the exposure triangle, the basics of how to achieve the proper brightness and characteristics of your desired images. For the Spotmatic F, one of the coolest niceties that really set it apart was the ability to use Open-Aperture Metering during image acquisition. This feature was only available when using the newly released super multi-coated lenses that contained an aperture indicator lever on the rear of the lens that would couple with another lever in the camera box. This lever would indicate to the light meter what the lens's aperture is preset at and will stop down to once the shutter is pressed and the exposure is taken. This means your viewfinder stays nice and bright to assist with manual focusing. The viewfinder would stay bright even when rotating the lens aperture ring to stop down the lens while you meter the scene and acquire the right exposure. Again, just for use with the super multi-coated lenses, the following are the steps you need to take your shot. First, ensure the ASA is set to that of the film speed loaded in your camera. Next, take off your lens cap. This will activate the light meter. Next, adjust your shutter speed according to your ambient conditions, a longer speed for darker conditions and a faster speed for brighter conditions. You'll come back to this step later if you need more or less light for your exposure. Now, viewfinder to your eye, you'll frame your scene and manually focus. You can see on the right side of the frame in the viewfinder there is located a matchstick light meter needle. The game will be to balance that needle in the middle. When the needle points up, we are overexposed, and when the needle points down, we are underexposed. So now, we are going to rotate the aperture ring on the lens while viewing that light meter needle through the viewfinder, stopping when we have successfully balanced the needle. If we cannot balance the needle, no matter the aperture we've selected, we can go back to our shutter speed to acquire the necessary light. Because the Spotmatic F has open aperture metering, our viewfinder stays nice and bright even though the aperture is stopped down. This allows us to continue checking focus and making adjustments as necessary. Once we are happy with our exposure settings, you can now release the shutter. So, those were the steps to follow if you're using the super multi-coated lenses with that new rear aperture indicating lever. But what steps do we use for all other lenses? We'll have to use stop-down metering to acquire the proper exposure, explained in the next section. The following steps are used for all other M42 lenses that require stop-down metering. Make sure the lens, when attached, has any automatic aperture selector dials set to manual, and start off with the aperture fully open to have the brightest scene while focusing. Ensure your ASA is set to that of the film speed loaded in your camera. Next, take off your lens cap, activating the light meter. Next, adjust your shutter speed accordingly to your ambient conditions. Now, viewfinder to your eye, you'll frame your scene and manually focus. Once you are sure of your focus, we are going to activate the stop-down switch on the side of the mirror box. Now we can rotate our aperture ring on the lens, while viewing the light meter needle through the viewfinder, stopping when we have successfully balanced the needle. You'll notice as you stop down the aperture, your viewfinder will become increasingly dark. However, once you are happy with your exposure settings, you can now release the shutter. I really think that now you can appreciate how nice that new open aperture feature is on the Spotmatic F. Next up, to operate the self-timer. First, ensure your exposure is set correctly and your film is advanced. Now, you can rotate the self-timer lever down. The amount you rotate the lever will indicate the length of time for your timer. You will have to rotate the lever at least to a 90-degree angle, which will provide for about 5 seconds, while a full 180-degree rotation will provide about 13 seconds. When you're ready, activate the self-timer by hitting the little button that was uncovered when you rotated the lever. The gearbox will begin slowly rotating back to its starting position, and when it gets there, the exposure is taken. To check the battery light meter, first, ensure you are using fresh batteries with the plus sign facing outward and matching against the plus sign under the battery compartment cap. Next, set the shutter speed dial to the bulb position and set your ASA dial to 100. Now, remove the cap to activate the light meter and look through the viewfinder. If the needle stays in the up position and stays steady, then you have a good battery. If the needle moves but starts to droop, you likely have a dying battery. If the light meter does not move at all, you either have a dead battery or it may indicate your light meter is broken. When you get to the end of your film roll and the indicator shows the correct frame for your canister, you'll feel the frame advance lever pull taut and you won't be able to complete a full ratchet cycle. Press the film rewind release button on the bottom of your camera. Next, flip open the film rewind crank on the top of the camera and start rotating the crank clockwise. You can feel the tension and hear the film being loaded back into the canister, and that tension will release when you have completed rewinding all the film. Now you can pull the film rewind crank up to the first position, and then pull once again to release the spring-loaded door latch and extract your rewound film canister. You'll also notice that the film counter has been automatically reset, ready for your next roll. Thank you for joining us on the Spotmatic F overview training. If you like this content and you want to see more like it, please like and subscribe. Thanks.